The heavy dampness of the Oregon autumn hung over the small town of Elderwood like a funeral shroud in October of 2021. The air carried a biting chill that promised an early winter, thick with the scent of wet pine needles, cold river stones, and the faint metallic tang of wood smoke rising from distant chimneys. The fog did not merely settle upon the landscape, but seemed to possess a life of its own, a silent and creeping entity that wound its ghostly fingers around the trunks of towering Douglas firs and draped itself across the sagging porches of the town's oldest residences. It was an environment of deep shadows and muffled sounds, where the world felt smaller and more intimate, yet strangely more dangerous for those who relied on senses other than sight. Thomas Elias sat in his usual spot on the weathered cedar porch of his small home, a structure that had stood for nearly a century and bore the scars of countless storms. At 70 years old, Thomas moved with a deliberate slowness, a grace born of necessity rather than choice. His eyes, once a vibrant blue that had scanned thousands of letters during his decades as a postal worker, were now clouded by a thick, milk-white veil of cataracts and the irreversible damage of a degenerative disease that had stolen his vision 5 years prior. To the casual observer, he was a figure of stillness, but beneath the surface, his world was a vibrant tapestry of vibration and sound. His fingers, calloused and mapped with the liver spots of age, danced across the strings of an antique violin that rested against his shoulder. This instrument was more than wood and varnish. It was a relic of survival, a masterpiece crafted in a European workshop before the First Great War, having survived the blitzes of London and the long winters of the American frontier. When Thomas played, the oppressive grayness of his blindness dissolved into a kaleidoscope of internal light. A sharp, high note felt like a flicker of yellow sun against his skin, while the deep resonance of the G-string evoked the rich browns of the earth he could no longer see. Beside him, resting a heavy head on his knee, was Boatswain. The golden retriever was a marvel of canine intuition, a service animal whose training went far beyond simple navigation. He was a silent guardian who monitored the very rhythm of Thomas's heart, leaning in closer when he felt a spike of anxiety or tapping a paw against the floor when the mailman approached. Boatswain did not bark at the world. He observed it with a quiet, watchful intelligence, his golden fur gleaming even in the dimming afternoon light. The peace of the afternoon was not merely interrupted, it was violently assassinated by the sudden guttural scream of a high-performance engine. The sound tore through the quiet fog like a jagged blade, followed by the rhythmic, chest-thumping assault of modern bass music that caused the very glass in Thomas's windows to rattle in their frames. A massive charcoal gray SUV, polished to a mirror shine that looked garish against the rustic backdrop of Elderwood, lurched to a halt at the edge of the property, its tires churning the gravel into a cloud of dust. The doors swung open with a synchronized arrogance, spilling out 3 young men who carried the unmistakable aura of inherited power and consequence-free existence. They were dressed in expensive varsity jackets and designer denim, their wristwatches glinting with the kind of gold that could buy a dozen homes in this part of the state. At the center of the trio was Kyle Stanford, a young man whose family name was synonymous with the very air the townspeople breathed. The Stanfords owned the timber, the land, and, by extension, the local government. Kyle walked with a swagger that suggested he believed the laws of physics and morality were merely suggestions for the lower classes. He was followed by Matt, a hulking presence with the broad shoulders of a linebacker and the empty eyes of a follower, and Jared, a lean, twitchy youth who seemed to feed off Kyle's malevolent energy. They were bored, fueled by expensive bourbon and the hollow thrill of finding someone who could not fight back. Thomas felt the vibration of their heavy boots on the wooden steps long before he heard their voices. Boatswain rose silently, his body becoming a rigid barricade between his master and the approaching figures. The dog did not growl, but a low, subterranean rumble began deep in his chest, a warning that went unheeded. The young men surrounded the old man, their presence an oily smudge on the sanctity of his porch. They laughed, a sound that held no joy, only the sharp edge of predatory amusement. Kyle reached out with a practiced cruelty and snatched the antique violin from Thomas's hands. The old man gasped, his fingers clutching at the empty air as if trying to reclaim his last connection to the light. The trio began a systematic desecration of the old man's sanctuary. Kyle held the violin high, mocking the craftsmanship that had endured for over a century before dropping it onto the porch and grinding his heel into the delicate wood. The sound of the ancient spruce splintering was like a gunshot in the quiet air. Thomas reached down, his hands trembling as he searched for the fragments of his life's joy, but he was pushed back into his chair by Matt's heavy hand. They laughed louder as they began to stomp on the instrument, reducing the survivor of 2 world wars to a pile of unrecognizable kindling and snapped catgut. Throughout this ordeal, Thomas could only huddle in his seat, his sightless eyes weeping silent tears of shock and humiliation. He reached for Boatswain, his only remaining anchor, and found the dog's fur damp with the cold fog. The animal was shaking, a high-frequency vibration of terror and suppressed protective instinct that traveled into Thomas's palm like an electric current. The dog remained silent, fulfilling his training, even as Jared began to kick at the animal's ribs, laughing as the retriever whimpered and tried to shield the old man's legs. The men believed they were invisible in the fog, protected by their wealth and the isolation of the street. However, they failed to notice a figure standing across the road in the driveway of a modest bungalow. Jackson Reed was a man who moved with a terrifying economy of motion, his body a collection of hard angles and conditioned muscle. He had spent the last decade in the world's most hostile environments, wearing the green beret of the Army's Special Forces, and had returned to Elderwood only a month prior to find a different kind of peace. He had been hunched over the engine of an old Ford pickup, his hands covered in grease, but his ears had been tuned to the environment with tactical precision. He had heard the scream of the SUV, the crash of the music, and finally, the sickening snap of the violin. Jackson did not shout a warning. He did not call the police, knowing full well that the Stanford name acted as a shield against the local badge. He simply wiped his hands on a rag, his gray eyes turning as cold and flat as a winter lake. He watched as Kyle Stanford flicked a lit cigarette onto the porch near the old man's feet, a final gesture of contempt before the trio headed back to their vehicle, their laughter echoing through the trees. Jackson knew their faces, he knew their lineage, and more importantly, he knew their vulnerabilities. He was a man who had been trained to dismantle entire networks with surgical precision, and he was now looking at 3 targets who had made the mistake of bringing a tantrum to a professional's doorstep. As the SUV sped away, leaving the old man sobbing amidst the ruins of his music, Jackson Reed stood in the shadows of his garage, his breathing steady and slow. He was already visualizing the terrain, calculating the response times, and selecting the tools he would need. He was no longer a civilian neighbor. He was a predator who had found a cause. The men in the charcoal SUV believed they had merely bullied a helpless old man, but they had actually tripped a wire connected to a mountain of silent, disciplined rage. Jackson knew that justice in Elderwood was a commodity that had to be manufactured by hand, and he was prepared to work through the night to ensure the delivery was made. Before this narrative of retribution and resilience continues, please take a moment to share with us where you are watching from in the comments below. If this story of an overlooked hero standing against the tide of arrogance moves you, please subscribe and join our community. The road ahead for Thomas and Jackson is steep, and the power of the Stanford family runs deep through the roots of this county, but even the strongest timber can be felled by a man who knows exactly where to strike. The fog continued to thicken as evening truly took hold, swallowing the charcoal SUV as it disappeared toward the wealthier estates on the hill. In the silence that returned to the porch, the only sounds were the ragged breaths of a broken man and the soft licking of a dog trying to soothe its own bruised ribs. Thomas Elias felt the cold wood beneath his fingers, searching for a piece of the violin that was large enough to hold on to, a talisman of what had been stolen. He did not know that less than 50 yards away, a man was already planning the systematic destruction of everything the Stanfords held dear. The war had come to Elderwood, and though the first blow had been struck by the bullies, the final one would be delivered by a shadow they never saw coming. Jackson Reed stepped out of his driveway and began to walk toward Thomas's house, his boots making no sound on the damp asphalt. He did not offer empty words of comfort as he reached the porch. Instead, he knelt down and began to pick up the splinters of wood with a grim, focused intensity. He looked at the bruised side of the golden retriever and the purple mark on the old man's cheek where he had been shoved. The air seemed to grow colder around him, a physical manifestation of the resolve that had kept him alive in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. He was a man who understood that some debts could only be paid in the currency of fear, and he was about to make sure that Kyle Stanford and his associates learned a lesson that was never mentioned in the hallowed halls of their Ivy League universities. The lesson was simple. There is always a larger fish in the pond, and sometimes that fish has been trained by the United States government to hunt in the dark. The heavy, moisture-laden air of Elderwood seemed to thicken as the confrontation on the porch intensified, transforming the familiar sanctuary of the Elias residence into a theater of calculated cruelty. Thomas Elias sat motionless, his sightless eyes fixed on a horizon he could only remember, while the vibrations of the three young men's presence resonated through the aged floorboards like the tremors of a coming storm. The silence that followed the initial intrusion was not peaceful. It was a vacuum filled with the sharp, acidic scent of expensive bourbon and the lingering exhaust of the idling SUV. Kyle Stanford stood at the center of this manufactured chaos, his silhouette blocking what little remained of the afternoon light, though Thomas only knew this by the sudden drop in temperature against his skin. The young heir to the Stanford fortune breathed with an air of practiced nonchalance, each exhale carrying the stench of fermented grain and the smug satisfaction of someone who had never encountered a barrier he could not buy or break. Beside Thomas, Boatswain had undergone a total metamorphosis. The golden retriever, usually a model of gentle patience, had risen with a fluid, silent grace that belied the mounting tension in his muscles. He positioned himself with tactical precision, his broad shoulders forming a living shield in front of Thomas's knees. The dog's claws ticked softly against the wood as he adjusted his stance, a sound that Thomas heard with agonizing clarity. Boatswain did not growl, for his training as a service animal had emphasized restraint and composure, but the air around him seemed to hum with a protective energy. His ears were pulled back slightly, and his focus was locked entirely on Kyle, tracking the slightest shift in the young man's weight or the twitch of his fingers. The dog was a statue of tawny gold, an ancient sentinel standing guard over a king who had lost his kingdom. Thomas felt his own heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt dangerously loud in the quiet of his chest. He clutched the neck of his violin, his knuckles white and stark against the dark, polished wood of the instrument. This violin, crafted in a workshop in 1922, was a marvel of lutherie that had survived oceanic crossings and the shifting tides of a century. To Thomas, it was not merely an object. It was a repository of memories, the voice through which he spoke to his late wife, and the bridge that allowed him to cross from the gray world of his blindness into a landscape of vibrant melodic color. The grain of the wood under his fingertips felt like a map of his own life, etched with the sweat of his labor and the tears of his losses. He could feel the heat radiating from Kyle, a physical manifestation of an aggression that was as senseless as it was overwhelming. The violation began with a sudden sharp movement. Kyle reached down with a predatory quickness and wrenched the horsehair bow from Thomas's trembling grasp. The old man's fingers closed on nothing but the humid air, a gesture of profound helplessness that only seemed to fuel the amusement of the onlookers. Kyle held the bow aloft, like a captured banner, flexing the expensive wood until it groaned under the strain. He spoke with a voice that was smooth and cold, a tone cultivated in private academies where empathy was treated as a weakness. He looked down at the violin and then at the dog, his gaze dismissing decades of craftsmanship and years of loyal service as if they were nothing more than debris on the side of a highway. To him, the old man was a relic of a dying era, an obstacle to the modernization and expansion his father envisioned for the county. Behind Kyle, Jared moved with a restless, twitchy energy, his eyes scanning the porch for some further means of entertainment. He held a crumpled aluminum can in his hand, the remnants of a high-priced energy drink mixed with something stronger. With a casual flick of his wrist, he launched the can toward Boatswain. The projectile struck the dog squarely in the flank with a hollow metallic thud. Thomas heard the impact and the subsequent rattle of the can as it skipped across the porch. He felt Boatswain flinch, a sudden involuntary spasm of the muscles under his hand. But the dog did not retreat. The animal merely adjusted his weight, his feet planting more firmly into the cedar planks, refusing to abandon his post, even as the sting of the blow radiated through his ribs. The bravery of the dog was a sharp contrast to the cowardly boredom of the attackers. The sensory world for Thomas had become a nightmare of auditory and tactile detail. He could hear the shallow, rapid breathing of Jared and the heavy, slow respirations of Matt, who stood like a silent monolith of muscle just a few feet away. He heard the rustle of their expensive synthetic jackets and the occasional clink of Kyle's heavy gold watch against his cuff. The laughter that bubbled up from them was a jagged, uneven sound that felt like it was intended to strip away the last remnants of Thomas's dignity. He tried to speak, but the words felt like dry husks in his throat, choked off by the sheer audacity of their intrusion. He was a veteran who had served his country and his community for half a century. Yet in the presence of these three, he was treated as less than the wood of his own porch. Kyle turned his attention back to the violin, his fingers tracing the F-holes with a mocking intimacy. He began to pluck at the strings, creating discordant, jarring notes that felt like needles in Thomas's ears. Each snap of the string was a violation of the instrument's soul, a desecration of the music that had filled the house for generations. The young man's arrogance was a tangible force, a suffocating blanket of entitlement that demanded total submission. He looked at Thomas's sightless eyes, realizing that he was not being watched, which seemed to irritate him. He wanted the old man to see the power he wielded, to witness the casual destruction of his world, and the fact that Thomas was shielded by his blindness only made Kyle more determined to find other ways to inflict pain. The air on the porch felt static and heavy, as if the oxygen were being consumed by the malice of the visitors. Thomas could feel the moisture from the fog settling on his skin, mixing with the cold sweat of his fear. He reached out a hand, searching for the comfort of Boatswain's head, but the dog was too focused on the threat to offer his usual lean of reassurance. The connection between the man and the animal was being tested by fire, a silent communication of shared terror and unwavering resolve. Thomas realized in that moment that they were not just threatening his property, they were attempting to erase his presence from the very land he owned. The Stanford family had long looked at this corner of Elderwood as an eyesore, a stubborn holdout against the luxury developments they planned to build, and Kyle was the vanguard of that erasure. Matt moved slightly to the left, his heavy boots creaking on a weak spot in the floorboards. The sound was like a groan from the house itself, a warning that the structural integrity of Thomas's life was under assault. Thomas could feel the displacement of the air as the large man shifted, a looming presence that felt like a mountain about to crumble onto him. He listened to the faint sounds of the town in the distance, the hum of a distant chainsaw, the call of a crow, and realized how isolated he truly was. The neighbors were either too far away or too intimidated by the Stanford name to intervene. He was alone in the dark, defended only by a dog that was being treated like a target for sport, and a memory of music that was being systematically dismantled. Kyle's grip on the violin tightened, and for a moment, the only sound on the porch was the creaking of the old wood and the distant, rhythmic thumping of the music from the SUV. The bass felt like a physical assault on Thomas's nervous system, a relentless pounding that mimicked the throb of a migraine. He felt the vibration in his feet, in his chair, and in his very bones. It was a sound designed to drown out everything else, to overwrite the delicate nuances of his life with the blunt force of modern excess. He reached deep into his memory, trying to find the strength of the men he had known in his youth, men who understood the value of hard work and the sanctity of a neighbor's peace. Но в этот момент тени прошлого казались бессильными против реальности этого жестокого нападения. The three young men continued their psychological siege, their presence a toxic cloud that refused to dissipate. They moved around the old man with a predatory grace, circling him like wolves around a fallen deer. Thomas could hear the grass being trampled under their boots as they stepped off the porch and back on, a restless, aimless movement that signaled their growing boredom and the need for a more violent crescendo. He knew that the destruction of the bow was only the beginning. He could feel the mounting energy in Kyle, a tension that was looking for an outlet, a spark that was about to ignite a fire. The blind man and the golden dog stood as the only things in the way of a total collapse of order in Elderwood, a fragile barrier of flesh and fur against a tide of unchecked privilege. Throughout this entire ordeal, the fog remained a silent witness, draping the scene in a soft, diffused light that made the violence feel surreal and disconnected from the rest of the world. The trees stood like ancient statues, their needles dripping with moisture, indifferent to the suffering on the porch. Thomas felt a profound sense of cosmic loneliness and realization that his long life of service meant nothing in the face of such raw, unearned power. He held on to the memory of the music he had played just minutes before, a melody of hope and resilience. But even that was fading under the weight of the bourbon-scented breath and the mocking laughter. The chapter of his life as a peaceful musician was ending, and a new, darker movement was beginning, orchestrated by the three young men who believed that the world belonged to them and them alone. Boatswain remained a rock of stability, his breathing now synchronized with Thomas's, a shared rhythm of survival. The dog's eyes never left Kyle, and though his ribs ached from the impact of the can, he did not allow his posture to falter. He was the embodiment of the protector, a creature whose love was stronger than his fear. Thomas felt a surge of love for the animal that nearly overwhelmed his terror, a realization that he was not entirely alone as long as Boatswain was by his side. But he also knew that the men would not stop until they had taken everything, until the music was silent and the porch was empty. The heat of their aggression continued to radiate toward him, a physical pressure that forced him deeper into his chair. A blind man waiting for the blow he knew was coming but could not see. The aftermath of the intrusion left the small house in Elderwood feeling like a hollowed-out shell, the silence within its walls heavy with the lingering echo of shattered wood and the cold dampness of the fog that had drifted inside through the splintered door. Thomas Elias sat in the deepening shadows of his living room, his trembling hands searching blindly across the surface of his side table until his fingers brushed against the smooth, cold plastic of his telephone. The device felt unusually heavy, a lifeline to a world he had tried to navigate with quiet independence until the events of the afternoon had stripped that dignity away. He knew only one soul possessed of the specific, cold-blooded competence required to handle a threat that the local law chose to ignore. Jackson Reed, the nephew of a man Thomas had served with decades prior, had recently returned from the scorching, high-stakes theaters of the Middle East, bringing with him a silence that was not empty, but filled with the watchful intensity of a soldier who had never truly left the field of battle. Less than 15 minutes passed before the low, disciplined rumble of a truck engine signaled Jackson's arrival. The front door opened with a quiet precision that stood in stark contrast to the violent kicking it had endured earlier. Jackson did not offer hollow words of comfort or the loud, useless lamentations that most civilians resorted to when faced with tragedy. He moved through the house with a predatory grace, his boots making almost no sound on the floorboards as he approached the old man. His eyes, the color of a winter sea under a slate-gray sky, immediately locked onto the dark purple hematoma blossoming on Thomas's cheek, then shifted to the pile of kindling that had once been a 1922 violin. He did not touch the debris, he simply stood over it, his mind cataloging the damage and the force required to inflict it with the clinical detachment of a forensic specialist. Jackson's backpack was a worn, olive-drab tactical kit that looked as though it had survived several deployments in the sand. When he opened it, the metallic slide of zippers and the soft rustle of equipment filled the room. He did not ask Thomas for permission to begin his work. The unspoken contract of protection had already been signed the moment Jackson walked through the door. From the depths of the pack, he produced a roll of industrial-grade reinforced tape, several small black plastic housings containing high-resolution motion sensors, and spools of high-tensile, translucent wire. He moved through the house like a ghost, his focus absolute and his movements economical. The transformation of the residence began at the primary points of entry. Jackson knelt by the front door, his fingers probing the wood of the frame to find the structural weaknesses. He used long, tempered steel screws to reinforce the strike plates and hinges, ensuring that the door would no longer yield to a simple kick. Above the lintel, he mounted a miniature camera with a wide-angle lens, positioning it so that the infrared signature would remain invisible to the naked eye in the dark. He worked in a methodical loop, moving from the front porch to the back service entrance, then to the windows. At each glass pane, he installed a vibration-sensitive trigger that would alert his handheld receiver at the slightest attempt to bypass the locks. The most sophisticated layer of the defense was the installation of the tripwires. Jackson unspooled the microfilament wire, stretching it mere inches above the floor, across the main hallway and the transition points between rooms. The wire was so thin it caught no light, effectively disappearing against the backdrop of the aged cedar walls. He connected these to silent alarms that would vibrate against his skin rather than emitting a sound that might warn an intruder. This was not merely about keeping people out. It was about creating a controlled environment where the element of surprise was reclaimed from the bullies and handed back to the professional. He treated the old postal workers' home as a forward operating base, a perimeter that had to be hardened against an inevitable second wave of aggression. For 2 hours, the house was filled with the sounds of a craftsman at work, the rhythmic turn of a screwdriver, the crisp snap of tape being sheared, and the faint electronic chirping of sensors being calibrated. Thomas remained in his chair, listening to the symphony of security. He could track Jackson's position by the slight shift in the air and the occasional click of a tactical light being toggled. The presence of the younger man acted as a stabilizer for Thomas's frayed nerves, the soldier's silence providing more reassurance than any police report could offer. Boatswain, too, seemed to recognize the shift in the environment. The golden retriever settled onto his haunches near Jackson, his tail giving a single rhythmic thump against the floor as he watched the perimeter being secured. By the time the sun had fully retreated behind the jagged peaks of the Cascades, the house had been effectively disappeared from the tactical map. To a passerby, it looked like a vulnerable, dark cottage, but inside, every square inch was monitored by a man who had spent his adult life hunting in the shadows. Jackson finally finished his rounds, his face showing no signs of fatigue, only a deepened mask of resolve. He moved to the kitchen, where the old-fashioned linoleum floor creaked under his weight. Without being asked, he began to prepare a meal, the clatter of pots and the hiss of boiling water providing a domestic counterpoint to the lethal preparations he had just concluded. As the scent of garlic and olive oil began to fill the air, the two men eventually settled at the small wooden table in the corner of the kitchen. Jackson had prepared a simple pasta, the steam rising in the dim light of a single overhead bulb. Thomas felt the warmth of the plate placed before him, his fork finding the food with the practiced ease of the blind. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of the unspoken. Thomas chewed slowly, the fuel for his body finally beginning to quiet the adrenaline that had been surging through him since the afternoon. He could feel Jackson sitting across from him, a solid, unmoving presence that felt as permanent as the mountains outside. The soldier's hands rested on the table, illuminated by the harsh, yellow light. Thomas could not see them, but he could imagine the topography of the skin, the thick, ropey scars across the knuckles, and the calluses formed by thousands of hours spent gripping a rifle and a rucksack. These were hands that had been broken and mended, hands that had known the sand of distant deserts and the cold steel of heavy machinery. They were the hands of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had decided to become the wall that stood between the predator and the prey. Jackson's breathing was slow and deep, the respiration of a man whose heart rate remained low, even when the world was falling apart. Thomas finally spoke into the silence, his voice a dry rasp that carried the exhaustion of his 70 years. He asked the question that had been gnawing at the edges of his mind since Jackson arrived. The younger man was on a hard-earned leave, a rare moment of respite from a life of constant deployment and high-stakes operations. There was no blood relation between them, only the thin, strong thread of a long-dead friendship between two veterans. Thomas wondered why a man with the world at his feet would choose to spend his time in a dusty, fog-choked town defending a blind man from a group of boys with too much money and not enough conscience. Jackson did not answer immediately. He set his fork down with a quiet clink and looked at the old man, his gaze piercing even through Thomas's sightless eyes. He looked at the bruised cheek and the way Thomas's shoulders were hunched, as if expecting another blow from the dark. Then he looked down at his own scarred knuckles, his mind briefly flashing back to the many times he had stood in similar rooms in foreign lands, watching the same play of power and cruelty. He had seen warlords in the mountains of Afghanistan and commanders in the dust of Iraq, all of them sharing the same arrogant belief that their status or their wealth gave them the right to grind the weak into the dirt. The silence stretched out, filled only by the distant, lonely call of a train whistle echoing through the valley and the soft, rhythmic snoring of boatsmen at their feet. Jackson eventually responded, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that carried the weight of a decade of hard miles. He spoke of the nature of power and the specific, burning hatred he held for those who used it as a blunt instrument. He explained that his 12 years of service had been defined by a single recurring mission, the systematic dismantling of bullies. Whether they wore expensive suits in a boardroom or tactical gear in a mountain pass, the archetype was the same. He had spent his youth learning the language of violence specifically so that he could speak it back to those who thought they were the only ones who knew the words. The evening wore on, the two men sitting in the island of light provided by the kitchen lamp. Jackson did not move to clean the dishes. He stayed in his chair, his eyes constantly scanning the darkened hallway that led to the front of the house. He was listening to the wind against the siding and the settling of the foundation, distinguishing the natural sounds of the house from any potential anomaly. He had already established a rotation for the night, a plan that involved him staying awake while Thomas slept, his handheld monitor resting on the table next to his arm. Thomas felt a strange, new sensation, a profound lack of fear. The terror that had paralyzed him earlier, the feeling of being a tethered goat waiting for the wolves to return, had been replaced by a sense of being part of a larger, more disciplined unit. He realized that the boys who had broken his violin were no longer the dominant force in the narrative. They were now the unwitting subjects of an observation operation conducted by one of the most dangerous men Thomas had ever met. The tactical closing of the distance between the threat and the protector was complete. The house was no longer a home. It was a trap. And Jackson Reed was the spring. As the night deepened, the fog outside pressed against the windows, a white wall that obscured everything beyond the property line. Inside, the sensors hummed with silent efficiency, their infrared eyes cutting through the gloom. Jackson remained as still as a statue, his presence a dark, reassuring shadow in the corner of the kitchen. Thomas eventually stood, guided by Jackson's hand to his bedroom where the bed had been checked and the window secured with the same invisible wire. The blind man lay down, the silence of the room no longer feeling like a threat, but like a shield. He knew that just beyond the door, the Green Beret was sitting in the dark, his gray eyes fixed on the monitors, waiting for the first sign of a silhouette in the fog. The hunt had not yet begun, but the perimeter was established, and the debt of the Stanfords was being calculated with a soldier's cold and unerring precision. The following morning brought a deceptive sense of normalcy to the fog-drenched streets of Elderwood, as the silver light of a clouded sun struggled to pierce through the dense canopy of the surrounding pines. Jackson Reed had orchestrated a brief excursion, a tactical necessity to ensure that Boatswain was physically fit after the previous day's assault, and to give Thomas Elias a few moments of breathing room outside the claustrophobic tension of the fortified house. The trip to the local veterinary clinic was intended to be a swift, surgical movement, a mere 40-minute window of absence that Jackson had deemed acceptable given the heavy reinforcements he had installed on the primary entrances. He had checked the sensors one last time before ushering the blind man and the golden retriever into his truck, the engine's low rumble the only sound in the damp morning air. They left behind a house that appeared silent and sleeping, a fortress of cedar and shadow that Jackson believed would hold against any amateur attempt at intrusion. The return journey was marked by a chilling shift in the atmosphere. As the truck turned the final corner onto the gravel road, Jackson's eyes, trained to detect the slightest anomaly in a landscape, immediately locked onto the front of the property. The heavy cedar door, which he had reinforced with tempered steel screws just the night before, did not merely stand open. It had been violently uncoupled from its frame, leaning at a grotesque angle like a broken wing. There were no signs of a struggle on the lawn, no lingering scent of exhaust, only the terrifying, hollow silence of a sanctuary that had been breached. Jackson felt the air in the cab grow cold as he brought the vehicle to a halt. He did not rush to the door. He moved with the predatory stillness of a man entering a kill zone, his hand instinctively checking the tactical knife at his belt while his mind raced through the failure points of his security. Thomas sat in the passenger seat, his sightless eyes wide with a sudden intuitive dread. He could hear the change in Jackson's breathing, the way the soldier's movements had become sharper and more lethal. When the truck door opened, the scent hit them before they even reached the porch. It was not the familiar smell of old wood and beeswax, but a sharp chemical miasma of cheap aerosol and the pungent, oily odor of spilled turpentine. Boatswain, sensing the violation, let out a low, mourning whine that vibrated through Thomas's hand. Jackson guided the old man up the stairs, his boots crunching on the shards of the decorative glass panel that had been shattered to bypass the deadbolt. The entry had not been an act of stealth. It had been an act of pure, unrestrained rage, a message delivered with a sledgehammer. As they crossed the threshold, the full scale of the desecration revealed itself. The interior of the house was unrecognizable, a chaotic landscape of ruined memories and shattered utility. The antique bookshelf, which held Thomas's rare Braille editions and the mementos of his 40 years in the Postal Service, had been overturned, the contents torn and scattered across the floor like dead leaves. The heavy oak dining table, the centerpiece of 1,000 quiet meals, lay on its side with one leg snapped clean off. Every piece of upholstery had been systematically sliced, the white stuffing spilling out like the entrails of a slaughtered animal. The air was thick with the dust of broken drywall and the suffocating fumes of the paint that had been used to defile the space Thomas had so carefully maintained since his wife's passing. The walls, which Thomas had kept a pristine, calming cream color to help him navigate by the reflection of ambient light, were now a nightmare of visceral color. Buckets of dark, sludge-like exterior paint had been hurled against the plaster, creating jagged, dripping starbursts that looked like wounds. The attackers had moved with a frenzied, infantile energy, destroying not just the furniture, but the very sense of order that allowed a blind man to exist in his own world. Every tactile landmark Thomas used to find his way. The edge of a counter, the frame of a mirror, the handle of a cabinet had been coated in a sticky, drying filth that rendered them useless. The house was no longer a home. It was a labyrinth of obstacles designed to humiliate and disorient. Jackson led Thomas toward the center of the living room, his own face a mask of iron. He saw the failure of his sensors. The intruders had not used the doors he had hardened. They had utilized a master key provided by a corrupt landlord to enter through a small, forgotten service hatch in the basement, bypassing the vibration triggers he had set on the main floor. It was a strategic humiliation, a sign that the Stanfords had deeper reaches into the infrastructure of the town than even Jackson had anticipated. But as his gaze swept the room, it landed on the dining area, and his heart turned into a cold, hard stone. On the small patch of the white lace tablecloth that remained untorn, the attackers had placed a grim centerpiece. Boatswain's leather service collar, the very symbol of his bond with Thomas and his role as a protector, had been placed there with chilling deliberation. It had been sliced clean through the middle, the buckle hanging uselessly to one side. Beside the ruined leather lay a single bloody tuft of golden fur, a sign that they had not only been in the house but had been watching the pair long enough to know what to leave behind to inflict the maximum psychological trauma. The collar was not just an object, it was a promise of future violence, a signature of a predator who wanted the prey to know exactly what was coming. Above the table, on the one expansive wall that remained standing, the final insult had been scorched into the plaster with bright, dripping red spray paint. The letters were large and jagged, written by a hand that trembled with a mixture of adrenaline and malice. It read, "The blind man will never find his dog. He is next." The message was a direct challenge to the protection Jackson had provided, a mocking refutation of the soldiers' presence. It was the point of no return, the moment where the conflict shifted from a neighborly intervention into a theater of total war. The attackers had made the mistake of believing that by destroying the house, they were destroying the man, but they had only succeeded in stripping away the last of Jackson Reed's civilian restraints. Thomas sank to his knees in the middle of the wreckage, his hands searching the floor until they found the ragged edges of the lace tablecloth. He felt the cold leather of the sliced collar, his fingers tracing the familiar metal tag that bore Boatswain's name. The old man did not scream. He let out a thin, broken sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, a vibration of pure, unadulterated anguish. He clutched the broken collar to his chest, his head bowing as the reality of his total vulnerability washed over him. He was a blind man in a ruined house, his only protector's symbol of office lying in pieces in his hands. The tears that fell from his sightless eyes were thick and hot, splashing onto the ruined lace as he rocked back and forth, a man who had lost his last window to the world. Jackson stood behind him, his shadow falling across the kneeling man and the red-stained wall. He did not reach out to comfort Thomas this time. He stood perfectly still, his breathing so shallow it was almost non-existent, his gray eyes fixed on the red paint. In the silent, toxic air of the room, something fundamental within the Green Beret snapped and resealed into a new, lethal configuration. The professional officer who had sought to mitigate the situation through defense and deterrence was gone. In his place stood the operator who had survived the shadows of the Hindu Kush, the man who understood that when the enemy refuses to be deterred, they must be systematically dismantled. The room seemed to darken as Jackson's internal focus shifted. He was no longer seeing the ruined furniture or the spilled paint. He was seeing the tactical errors of his enemies. They had left a trail of arrogance that was as clear to him as a map. They had used the service hatch, which meant they had help from the landlord. They had used a specific brand of high-gloss red paint available only at the local Stanford-owned hardware store. They had left the collar as a taunt, a psychological operation that Jackson had seen 100 times in foreign wars. He recognized the pattern of a man who believed he was untouchable, a man who thought that because he owned the land, he owned the people on it. Jackson reached down and picked up a single empty spray paint cap that had rolled into the corner. He rolled the plastic between his fingers, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like steel cables. The transition was complete. This was no longer about security cameras or reinforced locks. This was about target acquisition and the application of overwhelming asymmetric force. He looked at the back of Thomas's head, at the old man's shaking shoulders, and he felt a cold, crystalline clarity. The Stanfords had wanted to send a message that would break a blind man, but they had instead sent a signal that had reached a man who spoke the language of the void. The fog continued to press against the broken door, drifting into the room and mixing with the smell of the paint, creating a surreal, ghostly atmosphere. Inside the ruins, the silence was absolute save for Thomas's ragged breathing. Jackson Reed turned away from the wall and began to walk toward his bag, his movements now entirely devoid of wasted energy. He was already selecting the equipment he would need for the night ahead. He was no longer defending a home, he was preparing a battlefield. The point of no return had been crossed with a spray-painted threat, and the three young men who were currently laughing in some high-end bar had no idea that they had just summoned a ghost into their lives. As Jackson stepped over the shattered remains of a picture frame containing a photo of Thomas's wife, he felt a strange, detached peace. The ambiguity of the situation had been stripped away, leaving only the mission. He would secure Thomas in a safe house. He would retrieve the dog, and then he would visit a terrible, unforgettable justice upon the House of Stanford. The Green Beret was no longer a title or a memory. It was a living, breathing machine of retribution that had been activated by the sight of a broken collar on a white tablecloth. The hunt was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability, and in the quiet, ruined living room of Thomas Elias, the countdown to the destruction of Kyle Stanford had begun. Jackson looked at the red letters one last time, his gray eyes reflecting the malice on the wall with a cold, superior fire of his own. He was coming for them, and he would not be coming with a police report or a lawyer. He would be coming as the darkness they had tried to use as a weapon, and he would show them that in the dark, he was the only one who truly knew the way. The transition from protector to predator occurred within the silent, paint-fumed wreckage of the Elias home, as Jackson Reed shed the last of his civilian hesitation. He moved to his truck with a rhythmic, purposeful stride that signaled the commencement of an active operation. Within 5 minutes of opening his encrypted laptop, he had breached the digital perimeter of the Stanford family's social sphere, navigating through layers of shallow security to find a private, invitation-only chat group used by the town's elite youth. There, amidst a stream of self-congratulatory emojis and high-definition photos of expensive cocktails, he found exactly what he was looking for. Kyle Stanford had posted a grainy, triumphant image of the red-lettered threat on Thomas's wall, followed by a live location pin at the old Stanford lumber mill on the northeastern edge of the county. The caption boasted of a victory over a relic who didn't know his place and a promise that the celebration was just beginning. Jackson's face remained a mask of slate as he absorbed the data, his mind already overlaying the location onto a tactical map of the Elderwood outskirts. He reached into the back of his vehicle and retrieved a heavy black-hardened Pelican case that bore the scuffs and dust of 3 different continents. When the latches hissed open, it did not reveal a rifle or a handgun. Jackson knew that a traditional firearm was a crude instrument for the kind of psychological and physical dismantling he intended to perform. Instead, the foam interior housed a collection of specialized tools designed for low-light infiltration and non-lethal neutralization. He pulled out a pair of high-definition panoramic night vision goggles, a set of carbon fiber knuckles, and 2 high-voltage tactical immobilizers capable of dropping a grown man in a fraction of a second without making a sound. He checked the edge of his combat knife, the blackened steel reflecting no light, and secured his utility belt. He was no longer a man on leave. He was a silent, efficient machine of war, re-engaging with the skill set that had made him a ghost in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. The drive toward the old lumber mill was conducted in total blackout mode. Once he left the main highway, his vehicle's headlights extinguished as he relied on his internal compass and the faint glow of the stars through the fog. The mill was a massive, skeletal structure of rusted corrugated metal and rotting timber, a relic of the Stanford family's early rise to power that now served as a secluded playground for Kyle's degenerate circle. As Jackson approached the perimeter, he parked his truck half a mile away, disappearing into the dense Oregon brush before the engine heat had even begun to dissipate. He moved through the forest with a terrifying fluid grace, his boots finding the silent moss, and avoided the dry twigs with a subconscious ease. To any observer, he would have been invisible, a shadow moving within shadows, his breathing synchronized with the rustle of the wind in the Douglas firs. As he reached the edge of the clearing, he adjusted his night vision goggles, the world blooming into a surreal landscape of electric green and sharp contrast. He saw the charcoal SUV parked haphazardly near the entrance of the main hangar, its polished surface looking like a jagged obsidian tooth against the weathered mill. Inside the hangar, a generator hummed with a rhythmic mechanical heartbeat, providing a string of work lights that flickered against the high, vaulted ceiling. Jackson could hear their voices now, the arrogant, alcohol-fueled shouting of men who believed they were miles away from any possible consequence. He watched them through a gap in the siding. Kyle, Matt, and Jared were huddled around a makeshift bar of stacked stacked lumber, drinking from silver flasks and laughing about the way the blind man had looked when they shoved him. Jackson felt no anger, only the cold, detached focus of a surgeon about to make the first incision. He moved toward the external power relay with the deliberate pace of a ticking clock. His hands, gloved in thin, high-grip tactile silk, found the main breaker box on the hangar's exterior wall. With a single sharp pull, he severed the connection, plunging the entire facility into a darkness so thick it felt like a physical weight. The sudden silence of the generator was followed by a collective gasp from inside the hangar. The transition from light to absolute blackness was total, stripping the three young men of their primary sense and instantly activating the primal fear of the unknown. Jackson did not wait for them to recover. He slipped through a side-loading door, his eyes seeing every detail of the room through the emerald glow of his optics. Inside the hangar, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of sawdust and stale beer. But Jackson's senses were tuned to the sound of panicked movement. Kyle and his friends had scrambled to activate the flashlights on their smartphones, creating 3 frantic, erratic beams of light that danced across the rusted machinery. This was their fundamental tactical error. By holding the lights, they were broadcasting their exact positions while simultaneously ruining their own night vision, leaving them blind to anything beyond the narrow cone of their screens. Jackson moved through the maze of heavy saws and stacked planks, his footsteps absorbed by the thick layer of dust on the floor. He was a wraith, a phantom that existed in the gaps between their flickering lights. He chose Matt as the first target. The largest of the 3 was standing near a massive vertical bandsaw, his light swinging wildly as he cursed under his breath. Jackson approached from the rear, utilizing the humming of the wind against the metal roof to mask his final 2 steps. He did not use a weapon. He used the blunt force of his carbon fiber knuckles. A single, lightning-fast strike to the base of Matt's skull, delivered with calibrated precision, sent the large man into instant unconsciousness. Jackson caught the man's body before it could hit the floor, easing him down into the shadows and securing his wrists with heavy-duty zip ties in a single fluid motion. Matt disappeared from the board without so much as a grunt, his smartphone falling into a pile of shavings where its light pointed uselessly toward the ceiling. Kyle and Jared froze, the silence of their friend more terrifying than any scream. They began to call out Matt's name, their voices rising in a frantic, high-pitched register that betrayed their total lack of composure. Jackson was already moving toward Jared, who was twitching with a manic energy, his light beam shaking so violently it looked like a strobe. Jared backed away, his heels catching on a rusted cable, and as he stumbled, Jackson emerged from the darkness directly beside him. Before Jared could even register the presence of another human, Jackson applied a sophisticated pain compliance hold, a joint lock that sent a searing white flash of agony through Jared's nervous system. The young man's mouth opened to scream, but Jackson's other hand was already there, muffled and firm, as he drove Jared toward the ground. Within seconds, Jared was immobilized, his lungs fighting for air as the shock of the encounter shut down his will to fight. He was bound and silenced next to a stack of rotting cedar, leaving only one target remaining. Kyle Stanford was now alone in the center of the vast, echoing hangar. He was spinning in circles, his smartphone light cutting through the gloom like a desperate signal fire. He was no longer the arrogant prince of Elderwood. He was a terrified child in an expensive jacket, his breathing coming in ragged, hysterical gulps. He began to swing his light toward the corners of the room, sensing the invisible pressure of Jackson's presence but unable to fixate on a target. Every creak of the building, every groan of the metal roof under the Oregon wind sounded to him like the approach of a monster. He began to shout threats, his voice cracking and hollow, invoking his father's name and his family's wealth as if they were magical wards that could protect him from the dark. Jackson stayed just outside the reach of Kyle's light, circling him with a predatory patience. He wanted Kyle to feel the full weight of his helplessness, to understand the absolute terror of a blind man in a room full of enemies. He picked up a small metal bolt from a workbench and tossed it into the far corner of the hangar. The sharp clang against the metal siding sent Kyle screaming in the opposite direction, his flashlight beam lurching toward the noise. Jackson moved in from the blind spot he had created, his silhouette momentarily illuminated by the backscatter of Kyle's own light, looking like a demonic figure born of the fog. As Kyle turned back, his light finally caught a glimpse of Jackson's gray, emotionless eyes. The scream that died in Kyle's throat was replaced by a pathetic, whimpering sound as he realized the man from the driveway was not a civilian, but something far more dangerous. Kyle tried to run, his boots slipping on the oily floor, but Jackson was already there. He did not strike Kyle immediately. He simply stepped into the young man's path, a solid, immovable wall of muscle and intent. Kyle swung a desperate, clumsy fist, but Jackson parried the movement with a bored efficiency, catching Kyle's wrist and twisting it just far enough to bring the young man to his knees. The transition from the king of the town to a beggar on the floor was instantaneous. Jackson looked down at the shivering air, the green glow of his night vision making him look like a vengeful spirit. He reached down and took Kyle's phone, extinguishing the light and plunging the hanger back into the terrifying embrace of the void. Kyle's sobbing filled the space, a raw, ugly sound of a broken ego. Jackson felt no satisfaction, only the cold completion of a tactical phase. He had dismantled their group, neutralized their physical advantage, and stripped away their sense of security in under 10 minutes. The hunt in the shadows was over, but the reckoning was only beginning. He stood over Kyle, a dark sentinel in the absolute blackness, listening to the terrified heartbeat of the man who had thought it was fun to break a blind man's violin. Jackson Reed was no longer just a neighbor. He was the personification of a debt that was about to be collected in full. And as he began to drag Kyle toward the center of the room to join his bound companions, the silence of the Elderwood forest seemed to lean in, waiting for the final movement of the play. The transition from the absolute, suffocating darkness of the abandoned lumber mill to a blinding, artificial brilliance happened with the jarring suddenness of a lightning strike. Jackson Reed stepped to the main breaker and slammed the lever upward, flooding the rusted hangar with the harsh, unforgiving glare of high-intensity mercury vapor lamps. The hum of the reactivated generator filled the cavernous space, a steady mechanical drone that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of those trapped within. Kyle Stanford blinked hysterically, his retinas burning from the sudden influx of light, and as his vision cleared, the full reality of his predicament crystallized into a nightmare of steel and shadow. He found himself immobilized, his torso and limbs lashed to a heavy industrial chair with the rhythmic, unbreakable precision of military-grade cordage. The knots were not the clumsy work of an amateur. They were tactical restraints designed to ensure that the more he struggled, the more the friction of the rope would bite into his skin. To his left and right, Matt and Jared lay on the oil-stained concrete, their bodies trussed in complex professional coils that rendered them as helpless as livestock in a slaughterhouse. Their eyes were wide with a primal, animalistic terror, their muffled groans lost beneath the roar of the mill's machinery. Jackson stood directly in front of Kyle, a solitary and immovable figure bathed in the cold white light. He held a smartphone with a steady, unwavering hand, the camera lens fixed on Kyle's face like the eye of a vengeful god. The soldier's expression was a mask of granite, devoid of the heated anger that Kyle was accustomed to provoking in others. This was a colder, more clinical form of judgment. Jackson reached out with his free hand and adjusted a secondary light, angling it so that every bead of sweat on Kyle's forehead and every tremor of his lips was captured in high-definition clarity. The silence of the Green Beret was more oppressive than any shout could have been. He began to move the phone in a slow, sweeping arc, documenting the state of the three captives, the evidence of their presence in the mill, and the fear that had finally replaced their unearned arrogance. Kyle's mouth moved in a series of pathetic, voiceless spasms, his mind frantically attempting to calculate a price for his freedom. He looked at Jackson's scarred knuckles and the tactical knife sheathed at his belt, and the realization dawned on him that the currency of the Stanford family had no value in this specific arena. The psychological weight of the encounter intensified as Jackson set the phone on a tripod, ensuring the recording continued uninterrupted, and then moved to a nearby workbench. He pulled out a series of digital storage devices and a ruggedized tablet, his fingers dancing across the screen with a practiced, lethal efficiency. He began to upload the footage he had gathered over the previous 48 hours, the high-resolution infrared captures of the trio breaking into Thomas Elias's home, the audio recordings of their drunken bragging at the rooftop bar, and the devastating video of the red paint being applied to the blind man's walls. Jackson had orchestrated a total digital encirclement of his targets, building a dossier that was as undeniable as it was damning. He turned the tablet screen toward Kyle, showing the young man the progress bar of a file transfer addressed directly to the regional headquarters of the Oregon State Police and the Federal Bureau's Civil Rights Division. Jackson had purposely bypassed the local precinct, knowing that the Stanford name acted as a corrosive influence on the town's small police force. By elevating the case to state and federal levels, he had effectively removed the safety net of local corruption that the Stanfords had spent generations weaving. The air in the hangar felt thick with the smell of ozone and the cold, metallic tang of the surrounding machinery. Kyle's breathing had devolved into a series of shallow, ragged gasps, his eyes darting toward the shadows as if expecting a rescue that would never come. Jackson walked back toward the tripod, his movements economical and devoid of any wasted energy. He picked up the phone and began to record a new segment, his voice remaining a low, gravelly monotone as he dictated the facts of the assault on Thomas Elias, the destruction of the 1922 violin, and the specific threats made against the service animal. He spoke with the detached precision of an after-action report, stripping away the drama and leaving only the cold, hard bones of criminal intent. As he spoke, he moved the camera closer to Kyle, forcing the young man to look directly into the lens. The humiliation was absolute. The Prince of Elderwood was being reduced to a digital file, a piece of evidence in a machine of justice that was finally turning against him. Jackson's gray eyes reflected the harsh overhead lights, showing a man who had seen the end of empires and was entirely unimpressed by the tantrum of a local tycoon's son. While the generator continued to throb, a new sound began to permeate the Oregon night, the distant rhythmic wail of high-decibel sirens and the rhythmic thumping of heavy-duty tires on gravel. Jackson had timed the notification to the authorities with surgical accuracy, ensuring they would arrive exactly when the captives were at their most broken and the evidence was at its most organized. He did not flee the scene. He remained standing in the center of the light, his hands visible and empty, a silent witness to the collapse of the Stanford hegemony. Blue and red lights began to dance against the corrugated metal walls of the mill, reflecting off the puddles of rainwater and oil. The heavy doors of the hangar were pushed open, and a phalanx of state troopers in tactical gear flooded the space, their weapons drawn but their eyes quickly assessing that the situation was already under total control. Jackson provided a single sharp nod to the lead investigator, handing over the smartphone and the tablet without a word. The transition of custody was seamless, a handoff from a shadow warrior to the legitimate arm of the law. The following hours were a blur of flashbulbs and falling rain as Kyle, Matt, and Jared were led out of the mill in heavy steel shackles. The arrogance had been completely drained from their faces, replaced by the hollow, slack-jawed expression of those who had finally discovered that the world had limits. Kyle looked toward the dark woods, perhaps searching for his father's influence to manifest from the fog, but the state troopers ignored his whimpering as they loaded him into a transport van. The news of the arrest rippled through Elderwood before the sun had even cleared the trees, a shockwave that shattered the long-standing myth of Stanford invincibility. Federal warrants followed shortly after, as the threats against a blind veteran and the assault on a certified service animal triggered a cascade of charges that no amount of timber money could resolve. The legal scalpel that Jackson had sharpened was now cutting deep into the family's foundations, exposing a decade of land grabs and intimidation that had previously been buried under a layer of local silence. A week later, the atmosphere in Elderwood had undergone a profound shift. The oppressive fog that had once felt like a shroud now seemed like a refreshing mist, a sign of a town beginning to breathe again. Thomas Elias sat on the porch of his home, which had been restored through a monumental effort of local craftsmen and volunteers, many of whom had previously been too afraid to offer their help. The smell of fresh cedar and beeswax had replaced the toxic scent of paint. Thomas moved with a renewed lightness, his shoulders no longer hunched in anticipation of a blow. In his hands he held a masterpiece of lutherie, a new violin commissioned from a master craftsman in Portland. It was a gift from a national veterans organization, an initiative quietly organized by Jackson Reed through his network of former comrades. The wood of the new instrument was a deep, resonant amber, and as Thomas drew the bow across the strings, the music that emerged was not a lament, but a soaring, vibrant anthem of resilience that echoed through the pines. Boatswain lay at Thomas's feet, his golden fur clean and his spirit unburdened. The dog's ears twitched at the high notes, his tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump against the new cedar floorboards. He was no longer a target. He was the honored guardian of a man who had regained his voice. Jackson Reed stood in the shadow of his own garage across the street, his hands tucked into his pockets as he listened to the music. He did not seek thanks or recognition. His satisfaction was found in the steady rhythm of Thomas's bow and the absence of the charcoal SUV from the streets. He had fulfilled his self-imposed mission. transitioning the world around him back into a place where the vulnerable could play their music in peace. The Green Beret had faded back into the role of a quiet neighbor, but the town knew that beneath the surface of the silent mechanic lay a guardian whose vigilance never wavered. As the sun dipped below the jagged silhouette of the Cascades, casting long golden shadows across the Elias porch, the music reached a final, triumphant crescendo. The justice that had been delivered was not a matter of revenge, but of restoration. The Stanford family's grip on the county was fractured, the power was returning to the people, and the blind man who had been targeted for destruction was now the heart of a rejuvenated community. The story of Elderwood was no longer a cautionary tale of unchecked power, but a testament to the fact that even in the deepest fog, a single light of integrity can guide the way home. The silence that followed the final note was peaceful, a holy quiet that signified the completion of a long and difficult movement. If this story of courage, justice, and the unwavering bond between a man and his dog has moved your soul, please take a moment to share your heart with us. If you believe that no one is truly above the law and that the light of truth will always expose the shadows of cruelty, please write Amen in the comments below. We pray that you and your loved ones are shielded from harm and that you find the strength to be a beacon of protection for those in need within your own community. May the grace of the Almighty find you and keep you safe on your journey. Thank you for standing with us and for witnessing the victory of the humble over the proud. Until we meet again, stay vigilant and stay blessed.